Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. William, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Well, I'm beyond thrilled to have back with us one of the true heroes of the liberty movement, especially post-COVID. He is the founder of the Brownstone Institute. It's Jeffrey Tucker. Thank you so much for being here again.
Well, it's very nice to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, one of the reasons we invited you back was to talk about this recent interview that Ayn Rand Institute Chairman Yaron Brook did with Amesh Adalja. For those who don't know, Adalja is an infectious disease physician who, praises allies with Anthony Fauci. He's the Ayn Rand Institute's go-to expert on anything COVID. He's spoken at every OCON since COVID started. And on your own podcast, Amesh recounted some history of the early days of COVID and lockdowns. And, I thought, who would know better that history and what's going on? And that instantly made me think of you. But before we get to all that, Jeffrey, how are things going with you personally? What projects are you working on now?
I write 6 articles a week for the Epoch Times, which is quite an intense deadline schedule.
Sure.
And covering economics, but also pandemic response stuff, pharmaceutical industry, the intellectual world generally. I'm kind of all over the place, and they're very kind. They run everything I write. So 6 days a week, 4th largest newspaper in the world. It's quite a lot of reach. I'm very happy with that, in addition to running Brownstone, which was founded after the COVID response as a way to kind of come to terms with all of the failures of the period and all the things that period in time taught us in ways that should inform, in my view, inform our understanding of the world and help us be better at what we do. So it's quite a broad number of intellectuals and scientists and writers and journalists and attorneys speaking about the great crisis of our times, and it's, for many people, it's become an indispensable resource.
Absolutely, I'm one of them. Also, you really open up on your Twitter feed or X feed, I guess now. If people are not following Jeffrey on Twitter or X, they should be. I just a little gentle ribbing. I think sometimes you're a little rough on yourself sometimes, like not being quick enough on the vax, or I'm just thinking none of those establishment types ever question themselves like you do, certainly not publicly.
Here's the thank you. I was just finishing up an article on that very topic about the sort of merit or virtue of questioning your old paradigms and trying to see what went wrong. I maintain that anybody who is exactly the same person now as they were 3 years ago in an intellectual sense is either just a incredibly clairvoyant prophet or is just living in denial, because our times have shocked us so much with so many things that I don't think I anticipated. And I, of all people, should brag about having, not only written about pandemic planning 15 years ago and having sounded, I think, probably the only alarm, in the world about this, aside from D.H. Henderson at Johns Hopkins and a few others. This was back in 2005. I was writing about this stuff. But then also in January of 2020, warning about the possibility of coming lockdowns, universal quarantines, and these kind of pandemic controls on human liberty. I was warning about this, and travel restrictions and so on, back in January of 2020. So, I have sort of bragging rights, I guess. But yeah, there are certain things I overlooked. The number one issue that was to which I was a little bit blind was the extent to which the pharmaceutical companies had gained such enormous power over administrative state agencies. And I did not understand that relationship, the relationship between the administrative state and private industry and the patent monopolies and public health and pandemic planning. I also hadn't really understood the extent to which the general public was grossly ignorant of this topic and were willing to be browbeat by fake science in cooperation with the media, and the willingness of big tech to cooperate with the administrative state in censoring everybody's views. I mean, all of this stuff was way beyond anything I anticipated. And so when the vaccine, when they started pushing the vaccine back in April and May of 2020, I never thought it would amount to anything. I thought at best it would be some harmless potion that they would use as a kind of an excuse to end the lockdowns, which obviously could not continue forever. But I never really understood that maybe the vaccine was the whole point of the lockdowns. I was completely blind to that. I just wasn't cynical enough, basically. and I had not understood the real challenge that would be involved in sequencing a virus in January and then having rolled out jabs in Walgreens, 10 or 11 months later. I didn't realize just the dangers that were associated with that, because I had always thought that regulatory agencies were kind of more scrupulous, so they wouldn't be setting out to poison the population for example. I never believed that. And we had a long history of 5 or 10 years of trials before these drugs came to market, and I thought there would be some compliance with that, and that any attempt to sort of curb that the normal pace of discovery, production, and testing of that would produce something that was ineffective but largely harmless. I really hadn't imagined the level of malice that the system itself was capable of.
I think
Well,
we shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised about this level of corruption, because in the medical industry, we basically have a fascistic system. It's like the government is so intertwined with the drug industry, and providing grants and for research and all of this, and also buying billions of dollars worth of vaccines to distribute for free. I mean, the drug industry relies on this government money in order to function these days.
Yeah.
So they're just completely in bed with the government.
Right. And let me just add another point here that I because all that thing that you just said, I knew. There's a lot of things I knew intellectually. And I also knew that there was a big movement out there for pandemic planning, that I knew that it invaded the epidemiological world, that it had made progress in a lot of the journals, that the industry was in bed with this sort of paradigm. I knew all that, but so here's the problem. I didn't anticipate that these bad ideas that live in the realm of academia and journals and stuff would leak out into the real world. I saw it this way. I saw that there was, on one hand, an intellectual world, but it was increasingly irrelevant in light of the sort of trajectory of history that was destined, to emancipate us, thanks to all the innovations of the digital age and that sort of thing. And I mean, ultimately, I would say, I was treating a lot of what I was writing between, say, well, I would say a good part of my career, actually. I was treating it as a parlor game that I was, entertaining myself and others with, sort of jousting with in the intellectual realm, while believing all the while that liberty was going to triumph and we had this, and that people were never going to go along with this gibberish, and the intellectual world was ultimately not in charge. So what's funny about this is that that perspective actually forgets one of the very first essays I ever read by Rand. And you know what I'm going to say. This was back in high school. I read her essay called Philosophy Who Needs It, in which, is a really interesting essay saying that, ideas really do matter. And the things that you believe, you think you came up with them yourself or absorbed them from your parents or your teachers, whatever, but they ultimately came from a thinker, a philosopher, an influential voice out there who, dripped poison in somebody's ear, or maybe is a good thought too, but they they spread an idea, and then it kind of began to embed itself in the culture, and ultimately the world is built by ideas and ideas only. And that was the message of her really brilliant essay. I mean, it's wrong in some particulars, of course, but I mean, just overall, thematically speaking, it's a very powerful essay. And her cry to the world, which dominated a good part of her life, was take ideas seriously. You know, what we believe about ourselves and the world around us has an effect on the kind of world in which we live, that there is no artificial separation. This is not a parlor game. When we talk about ideas and philosophy, we are talking about the quality of life we want to live and the kind of world in which we want to live. And it really does matter. And I believe that. I would say I was persuaded by that in high school, but it's sort of gradually over time, I think I lost touch with that fundamental conviction that she had, and that's really regrettable. So yeah, I find that more and more, we have to return to her root ideas in order to remind ourselves of what really matters. And she never really accepted the idea that this Hegelian sense that history was on a certain course, that there's certain things that are predetermined, or that God has willed things to be a certain way. She never believed that. What she thought was that we lived only in the kind of world that we fight for, that we believe in and fight for and stand up for. That's that we are the builders of our own world. That was her belief. And I think she was right about that. It's sometimes too easy to forget.
Yeah, I think that, you talk about the parlor game, that is just thinking that ultimately the good is going to triumph, and that's understandable.
Yeah.
But this is all actually a great segue into these clips, many of such themes that will come up. And I'm just really curious to get your take on some of this. In this first clip from the show, Amesh Adalja is saying that much more needed to be done in early 2020.
At that point, we should have been on a very proactive approach, the way Taiwan was, for example, and starting to fortify the country as best as we could, knowing that probably we're going to have 100,000 deaths no matter what happens. But we can stave off all of the economic disruption by really being aggressive. But instead, January, February, half of March, nothing happened in the United States. It was basically coming from the highest levels of the White House that this is not going to be a problem.
In those days, the highest levels of the White House were listening to public health authorities, and the public health authorities were deferring to the wisdom of the ages, which is to say that you can typically do more harm than good by belligerently locking down a population, or forcing masks on people, or imposing social distancing. This was ultimately destructive. That was the prevailing view at that time. 800 scientists at Yale University all put out a message to that effect. And the other thing is, we knew by late February that what the case fatality rate, or the infection fatality rate, was of COVID, and it was not 2, 3, 4% like the World Health Organization was saying, or that the CCP was telling the world, but was much lower than that. It was far less than 1%, and that the focus of concern was exclusively on the elderly and the infirm, who were likely to die of something or anything, and COVID would just happen to be the thing. So I think the White House was taking the right view in January and February and in early March. And in fact, Fauci himself recommended against lockdowns as late as an article appearing in February 28th, though he had changed his mind by that time. What switched everybody was a World Health Organization report that came out in I think it was February 26th. And this was a junket that was paid for by the CCP, but they brought in public health scientists from the UK and Europe and the United States. Fauci sent his deputy assistant, Clifford Lane, to go on a kind of Potemkin village tour of Wuhan. And the CCP told everybody, look what we did. We welded people into their apartments. We quarantined everyone. we kept everybody separate. We emptied the streets. We imposed all sorts of travel restrictions, and then the pathogen went away. Now, if you believe that at the time, if you believe that, then you're a complete idiot. Really, I mean, there's no new virus that's ever come along in history that's ever just gone away. They all still exist. I mean, even smallpox is the only disease affecting human beings that's ever been eradicated. But even that still exists in a small vial. I think it's in Ukraine, actually. So the idea that you would make a fast-moving respiratory virus intimidated by state power is a stupider idea than even socialism.
Well, you're making
What do
a
you make of the claim? What do you make of the claim about the lack of proactivity? Like he uses that phrase as if it's supposed to mean something specific, but he never really gets into specifics. Like, do you think he means something like Chinese lockdowns, or was he talking about just wearing more masks or testing, or what do you imagine he was talking about when he says something like that?
Well, when I've heard people of his school of thought use the word proactive, what they really mean is Chinese style lockdowns. He certainly doesn't mean better therapeutics. That's what we should have been doing, figuring out what kind of generic drugs we could repurpose to antiviral drugs that we could repurpose for the purposes of saving lives. And that would have been a good kind of proactive. But when he's talking about proactive and he's complaining about the White House didn't do anything.
He mentions Taiwan. Do you know what was Taiwan doing in December, January, and February?
Well, they followed the CCP model and locked down for a time and muscled the population and kicked people around and that sort of thing. But and lots of states did this actually early on. I mean, Australia and New Zealand moved pretty quickly. Japan, a lot of the Asian countries did. They had experienced SARS-CoV-1 back in 2013, which had a very high fatality rate, and there's a great deal of confusion on exactly why SARS did not spread around the world. And there are really two schools of thought on this. One is that the World Health Organization spent a lot of money and made a lot of phone calls and did a lot of contact tracing and that sort of thing and contained the virus. So a lot of people believe that. A lot of people do not believe that. They think that the virus was self-limiting because it had a really high fatality rate. I mean, really high. I don't want to put a number on it because we actually don't know what it is. I mean, one of the problems with calculating fatality rates is you have to know the infection rate. And to know the infection rate means you need to have universal and accurate testing, which we'd never had. So the fatality rate, the infection fatality rate, and the case fatality rate might be far lower for SARS than what we believe. But, sometimes people throw around very high numbers, 3 and 4%, typically. But we don't know if those are true. But the point is that it was definitely a deadlier strain than SARS-CoV-2. So, and people need to understand something about the dynamics of the microbial kingdom. So a virus that kills quickly, is reminds me of that scene in Gladiator, you kill too quickly, is not going to spread because it kills the host. So that's a dumb virus. And there are many dumb viruses out there. Ebola is the classic case. So if you kill the host, then it doesn't spread. But if it doesn't kill the host, then it's much more mild, and it just gives you an infection and, a few days bedridden and some fever and sniffles and that sort of thing. Then it's going to spread and spread and spread and spread because the host is not dead. So there's, in other words, there's always within the viral kingdom a trade-off between the mortality associated with the virus and its prevalence. So that the more deadly the virus, the less prevalent it's going to be, and the more it spreads, then by definition, the less deadly it is going to be. And that is the sort of trade-off. Now there's a condition here called latency. And latency is how long the virus can hang around in you without giving you symptoms. So initially they were claiming that there's a long latency period to this, and they were throwing around numbers like 14 days. And that's why, and if there really is a 14-day latency period to respiratory virus, then maybe you could get to a 2 or 3% case fatality rate, maybe. But that turned out to be a complete fantasy. It turns out the latency period for SARS-CoV-2 is pretty much the same latency period you get from a common flu, or even another coronavirus type, which is the common cold, which is to say it's 2 or 3 days. I mean, for 2 or 3 days, you're infectious before you show symptoms, and then your infectivity goes away before your symptoms have entirely disappeared. I mean, that's what I was taught about most common viruses when I was growing up, and for some reason we dispensed with that wisdom early on with SARS-CoV-2, just out of sheer panic or just misinformation, something.
We may have a theory. You do make a crucial distinction about how the scientific community changed between the early part of February and the later part of February. After that first clip, Amesh tells Yaron that he warned him of this, all of this in February of 2020, but it must have been late February 2020 because William found video of Amesh on with Yaron from February 1st, 2020.
All the cases outside of China, none of them have been fatal. All the cases in the United States are mild. So I do think you're going to see this case fatality rate drop much lower than 1%. And this is going to be basically clustered in those who are elderly, those who have other medical conditions. And I think it's going to be a burden for hospitals and healthcare systems to deal with the cases because they're going to get inundated with a lot of cases coming in, just like we do in flu season. But I don't think this is going to be it's going to probably be it will qualify as a pandemic, but it's not going to be a very severe pandemic because the fatality rate is much less than what we're seeing now. And we'll get a picture of that in more time.
That's a very interesting clip. That's a very interesting clip because that was the conventional wisdom between, say, February 1st and about February 26th from the whole of the medical establishment in the English-speaking world. That was it. That's what they believed in, and that's accurate. I mean, that was a correct view. I mean, at 3.5 years later, we know that everything he said there was exactly right. I mean, at best, it was a severe flu, but he's also right about that who the vulnerable populations were, and that should have been the where the attention was focused. What do you do with the people that are facing medically significant consequences from this? And the answer would have been better therapeutics. When people get sick, what you want to do is figure out the best way to get them well. That didn't happen. Once the panic hit, again, after the World Health Organization report, which is just a bunch of lies, the U.S. response was intubating people in the hospitals and giving them remdesivir, which is a very, very wicked drug that destroys the kidneys and wrecks many bodily organs, and many people just died from the remdesivir, and many others who died from secondary infections that followed the intubation, and they weren't given antibiotics. So it's just, I mean, the whole thing is just mind-blowing. I mean, we know, looking back at 1918, that a substantial amount of the death, I mean, maybe as much as half of the death, was a result of secondary infections. And we believed that we would never repeat this experience again because now we have, penicillin and moxicillin, all these antibiotics that cure these kinds of secondary infections. But during the first year after we began to freak out about SARS-CoV-2, prescriptions of antibiotics went down by 40%. The reason for that is that people stopped going to the doctor, stopped going to the hospital in a pandemic, if you can imagine. And doctors just stopped prescribing, basic repurposed generic drugs, all in anticipation of a vaccine that, by the time it arrived, had not gone through proper testing, so turned out to be ineffective and unnecessary, ineffective, and not safe.
Notice he's almost nonchalant and about the fact that hospitals could be inundated for a while. That comes up later again, but just this is the beginning of February and he's talking like it's about to wind down, but now it's somehow Trump's fault that the scientific community had to change of heart later in February.
Yeah.
Also in that February 2020 interview, he says a lot of other things that don't really mesh with what he's saying now. Because what he's saying now is that he was warning about this lack of proactivity, and he was trying to convince us that, he had a good idea that this was going to be bad and all that. But really back then he was saying things like we had an appropriate reaction in the beginning. There was nothing in that interview about Trump doing the wrong thing or not being proactive.
Yeah.
He was saying we should wind down the emergency measures. That's the sorts of quotes we're getting from the interview. And I suggest that our audience go back and listen to that February 1st, 2020 interview. It's because you'll be shocked by how he's just like, this is a regular flu season. This isn't going to be a severe pandemic. This is the rhetoric he was putting forth. I have a theory on why he was saying that, and I think it's because there was this push to not cause panic, right? So they didn't want to cause a panic, which would affect the stock market. And this is something he brings up
ultimately.
Yeah,
right,
that's what's weird, and that's right. You should never cause it. I mean, panic doesn't achieve anything. In fact, the panic that was engendered from basically February 27th and onward likely led to a lot of deaths. I mean, there's a great deal of evidence that people, once they heard that there was a terrible pathogen in the air, started freaking out about each other, and it was like something out of a dystopian novel, and began to feel sick, and then press the calling 911 and going to the hospital, and then they shove a tube down your throat, and then you die. And so, there's other weird things that, especially in New York, right? This didn't affect most places in the country. I mean, there wasn't widespread community spread of SARS-CoV-2 in most parts of the country, even after lockdown. So it's actually one of the dumbest things. I mean, you want to lock down the whole country at the same time? Well, the virus wasn't in Texas. It wasn't in most Western states at the time. For God's sake, it was, it was springtime. The sun was out. That's a great disinfectant. It just wasn't a going concern in most parts of the country. But then we locked down. But in New York, there was pandemonium, which resulted from the tendency to push. They closed all the hospitals for one thing, and so then there were only 2 hospitals open in the Bronx and Queens and some other places that were particularly hard hit, and so they shoved all the people into one hospital to create the appearance of overcrowding, and then remdesivir and intubation and secondary infections killed vast numbers of people. And then because the lockdowns, the coroner's offices and mortuaries and funeral homes were entirely closed, and people in those days were claiming that you could get COVID by touching somebody, so people were afraid of the dead bodies, so people would suit up in these hazmats and zip up the dead in body bags, and there wasn't anybody to take care of the bodies, and much less to bury them. So they just shoved them in freezer trucks for the duration, and then the media went in and took a bunch of films of freezer trucks all over New York, and that was very alarming. Broadcast that around the country, saying, "Oh, look, there's so many people dying. They're all in freezer trucks." Well, they were in freezer trucks because nobody would touch the bodies, and the coroner's offices were closed, and that's why they were in freezer trucks. But you see how it just contributed to this panic, and it seems to me, I mean, we've had a long time to think about this. This is all deliberate. There was an attempt on the part of the establishment, and our friend there with whose clip you're showing is just clearly just a mouthpiece for his industry. That's all. I mean, he's just Mr. Conventional Wisdom. That's all he's doing. So the conventional wisdom in early February and mid-February was, this is going to be mild, and they were right about that. That was, there was just one population that was ultimately vulnerable to medically significant consequences from this. And then he flipped in the other direction, and just like the whole medical establishment flipped, after the World Health Organization report, and it was like, well, okay, now it's time to create panic, and it all happened at once. Fauci flipped, New York Times went the other direction, and then the Trump administration was resisting this. Even as late as March 10th, Trump was tweeting out, look, people die from respiratory infections all the time, and things going to come and go. And then on the 10th, he went the other direction and said, we're going to use all the power of the federal government. By the 12th, he'd imposed travel restrictions from Europe, and by the 13th, he had imposed a national emergency. Very, very dangerous.
Well, you know what they say? They say follow the money. And before the panic, or before everything became an emergency and a problem, Amesh Adalja was making money off of big pharma, especially Merck, to the tune of $36,000 a year, shilling for their products. And if he had been sidelined like Nancy, like he brings up the case of Nancy Messonnier, the CDC person who got sidelined for warning about the pandemic. He brings her name up back in May of 2020. And it seems like he doesn't want to get sidelined, because if he gets sidelined, he can't go on news programs and shill for the big pharma companies. And so he'll lose his income. But then after it becomes an emergency, it becomes okay to talk about it. And also he wants to start pushing for the vaccine, because that's going to make money for big pharma. So it seems like this is all about money for him.
Yeah.
And if we don't follow the money, we're going to miss a big piece of this whole problem.
Jeffrey, it's a major problem in the scientific world in general, especially with biochemistry and the pharma companies and the medical establishment and everything. They're all dependent on government money. There's $30 billion coming from NIH, and there's trillions of dollars coming in and out of farm companies, and the patent racket. I mean, we saw the Open the Books released the other day, all the royalties that NIH employees are getting from big pharma, and that's connected with the FDA. And the whole thing is a giant cartel. So that I spent 4 hours yesterday morning talking to a biochemical PhD researcher with the pharma companies associated with a high-end Yale University. I just said the university, sorry, a high-end Ivy League university. And she just kind of mapped it all out for me. And it was so horrifying what she was describing. I said, how do you live?
Well, this actually kind of segues into the next clip from 2023, where Yaron asks Amesh about Sweden, which Amesh dismisses as middle of the road.
What were the long-term consequences for Sweden of that policy? How did it pan out for them?
I think they didn't do as well as you would. They didn't do the kind of middle of the road. They're not the worst. They're not the best. And as you said, many people still did the exact thing that other countries were doing, but they did it voluntarily, which on its face is better if you're using voluntary means to do it. They didn't quite protect their elderly as much as you wanted them to do, as they could. They could have probably. It's not. I think it's kind of used as this kind of like this trial. The people use it kind of for political purposes to say, well, what about Sweden? But I think it's not really. It's a muddled case, and I don't know that that's the paradigm.
Okay, it's not a muddled case. They have the lowest. They have the lowest excess mortality in all of Europe for there's a period in which there was a lot of death in Sweden, and he's maybe right. They could have protected the elderly more, maybe a little more focus on long-term care facilities and that sort of thing. But that was just initially. But society went on. They never closed the schools. There were no masks. There were no masking. Everybody just went on. And what you see at the end here is the lowest excess mortality in all of Europe, and no learning losses, no psychological disorientation, no soaring suicides, no economic crisis. Everything just went on exactly as normal. They did make a mistake with vaccines, but they never mandated them. So of all countries in the Western world, Sweden was by far the best. The whole world should have done what they did. There were many African nations that didn't do anything either. And then
Well, he's
Latin
looking at
American.
mortality rates because, like you said, Sweden should be judged on not upending the lives of so many of their young the way we did with
Right.
depression, learning disruption challenges that we're still dealing with.
Yeah, an economic calamity, right? They didn't blow the budget. They're not facing high inflation. Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is, our cities are falling apart. Right? So we've got rampant crime and drug abuse, substance abuse in this country. So, the sort of calamity is true in Europe too. Any country that locked down is facing the consequences of that. But a place like Nicaragua never did anything either, and Nicaragua has an immigration problem now, which is too many. So many Americans are moving there. They're so impressed by the fact that Nicaraguan government didn't do anything. And by the way, that place is run by a communist dictatorship, but Daniel Ortega of all people. And when the World Health Organization was screaming at him to lock down, his response was, "Look, we're a poor country. We can't afford to do that nonsense. I have to let my people work. I'm not here to tell people what they can and cannot do. That's not my job." This is the communist talking.
All of this also goes to the issue of trusting authorities, because if the authorities start making these mandates and lockdowns and all that, and then they violate their own rules, then the common person looks at that and says, well, why should I be following these rules? These guys are corrupt, and they just, they're doing stuff that they're telling us not to do. And so that kind of creates this culture or atmosphere of a corrupt government. And then you start losing trust in your authorities. And so, I mean, if there's anyone to blame for this lack of trust in experts and authorities figures, it's the authority figures themselves who are not obeying their own dictates.
The pandemic response throughout the West was a ruling class racket. It was the 1/3 of the people can work from their laptops, plus government, plus wealthy individuals and industries that were exploiting the working classes, bring me my food, deliver my groceries, take care of me if I get sick, but otherwise I'm just going to hang out here and with my little small circle of friends, earn a high income and type on my laptop. It was a class-based response. And what we've learned from the period is that the people who are writing about it and influencing opinions came from the same classes that benefited the most from the pandemic response. Whereas the people that are driving the trucks or delivering groceries to your front door, are typically not on Twitter or otherwise writing for the New York Times. So they were completely excluded.
It's true. One more thing. I like how he says that making it voluntary seems better on its face. I mean, people having more liberty is not just better on its face; it's better in reality.
I find myself enormously annoyed by the people within sort of broadly considered, libertarian circles who think that we should have had a state-like response except voluntarily, which is to say we should have voluntarily socially distanced. Who says? I mean, that's ridiculous. There's exposure is not evil. To say you should do voluntarily what the state otherwise wants you to do is to completely acquiesce to a despotic vision of society. There was nothing good about what the state did. And even if it had been done voluntarily, voluntarily put on a useless mask, voluntarily not go to the beach, not go to parties, voluntarily taking your kid out of school, what the hell? Everything the state asked us to do was the opposite of public health. And if it had been done voluntarily, that would have been a signal that people are idiots, not that they were smart. So I can't stand that line. I've heard this from economists all the time that, well, we didn't need to lock down because people were already hunkering down and quarantining for themselves and volunteer. God, amount of idiocy. There was one famous libertarian intellectual. By the way, there were so many libertarian intellectuals who just completely and utterly failed during this period. But there was one guy who wrote me and said, look, I think there should be a voluntary response. For example, I'm not going to go to a grocery store that has a two-way grocery aisle. I only want to go to grocery stores with one-way grocery aisles. And I was like, what are you, are you a germaphobe? I mean, so hypochondria is, the thing that you think it's normal for a grocery store to have a one-way aisle?
Germaphobes
out of
were
your
part of their
mind.
army.
Yeah,
I was reading an article about a guy who worked in the movie industry as an extra during COVID, and he said that they were in a gym. This was like a sports movie, and they were in a gym for like 12 hours in the day, and they would spend minutes without a mask, shouting and screaming and cheering, and then during breaks they would have to put their mask on. It's like, what kind of bonkers universe do you live in when you think that's going to help you?
Yeah, the irrationality of it was completely out of control. And libertarians and objectivists are supposed to be sort of the rational people, but they proved to be as nutty as anybody. I mean, my favorite case in point was Walter Block, who's this lifetime anarchist, and in writing about this, he was a partisan of lockdowns. He thought lockdowns were really great, and explaining why, he said, it's because spreading a germ to other people is an act of aggression. And so, for example, if somebody sneezes on another person, that person really should be arrested by the police and charged with a crime. And this is true in all times, in all places. Yeah, it's
Worst anarchist ever.
Yeah, worst anarchist. I mean, we live surrounded by pathogens, and we live long, healthy lives precisely because of exposure to pathogens that prepare our immune systems to fight off more severe diseases. So, which is to say that if somebody sneezes on you, that could be, if you want to adopt Walter Block's wacky paradigm, a positive externality. The person could be doing you a favor by giving you exposure to a small a less dangerous pathogen to protect you in a cross immunological sense from a more dangerous pathogen. I'm not saying that's necessarily true. I'm not saying it could be true, but exposure is the key to health, not isolation, not staying out of the sun, but getting around other people, mixing with other people. In other words, freedom, especially the technology of travel, really gifted to humanity much stronger immune systems than we've ever had. And we have much stronger immune systems than any people in the whole of history. Well, I should say that before 2019, more than all people in the whole history of the world. I mean, back when the colonial settlers came to the Americas in the 15th, 16th century, it seemed to be like, a third or half or as many as 2/3 of the native population died from smallpox. And smallpox is, the single most wicked pathogen you can possibly ever imagine. So, it's been exposure that's granted us much longer lives, and particularly after the age of travel, when people are traveling all over the world, and it's the best way to improve your immune system is through travel and exposure to a variety of pathogens, all over the world, and it's good for us as long as we're healthy to withstand it. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger, as the old song says. It's just a hard and fast rule. So for people like Walter Block to create this strange anthropocentric view that somehow the human beings are pure and unsoiled and have to stay that way through isolation from each other is a totalitarian vision. It's not a vision of a freedom-minded intellectual.
He's probably a germphobe.
Well, it's
Yeah, most likely he's probably just a germaphobe. I don't really know, or he's just really confused, and which is another thing that really drives me nuts about what we've seen from so many intellectuals over the last, well, particularly libertarians, really, over the last 3.5 years. Their unwillingness to pick up a basic tutorial in the immune system or viruses or immunology. I mean, when this whole thing hit back in January 2020, I downloaded Cell Biology for Dummies from Amazon, read it, and then I thought, well, I've got that one, so I read another undergraduate text on virology, and then I read a first-year medical text on antiviral therapeutics. So yeah, I did the work. Damn it, Walter Block can't read a Cell Biology for Dummies just to fix up his own knowledge. He's just going to sit in his armchair and make shit up. Well, I'm sorry. As Ayn Rand would say, ideas have consequences.
Well, in I think that's fair. They go on, and Amesh is kind of saying it's basically the state's fault, that they were just giving advisories, and then all the states went crazy with it. But as if there was no implied compulsion or, at least pressure of government scientists ready to call them murderers or people that want to let it rip. I mean, they attacked Sweden and even states like South Dakota and Florida that they didn't think locked down or shut down enough, as their way of putting pressure on people. Then Yaron asks Amesh about the Great Barrington Declaration, something you were quite intimately involved with. And Amesh first tries saying that there were things he agreed with, like treating 8-year-olds differently from 60-year-olds, but then claims the timing just wasn't right.
But I think by the time the Great Barrington Declaration came about, there were questions about what would happen if you let it rip, or if that's not what the Great Barrington Declaration said. But if you had unchecked spread, if you just told people go about your life as if this is minor, we were still at a point where hospital capacity was compromised. Hospital capacity was horrendous in December of 2020, January 2021, February. I was working there. I've never seen anything like that in my life. And we were at the verge of collapsing. The healthcare system couldn't do anything else. That's all we were doing day in and day out. And I think what we needed at that point, by the time of when people were making these debates, it was almost too late. That there was so much COVID in the community, so many people getting hospitalized, that we really feared for the ability of the healthcare system to survive.
So that's just special interest pleading. ICUs are always 90% full. That's just the way it always is. And you can go back decades and see hospital administrators complaining about, oh, we're overcrowded, we're overrun. We need more resources. Give us more money.
But didn't he tell us calmly in February 2020 that hospitals might be overwhelmed for a while?
Yeah, but
that's always that the system was about to collapse.
Yeah. That's always a plea for more money. But and it's really not true. I mean, actually most hospitals around the country in 2020 were complete ghost towns, and you can see that by all the dancing nurse videos. It's pretty interesting. I mean, I'm really familiar with the Texas case because that's where my family lives, and that's where I'm from. So the hospitals throughout Texas, from one end to the other, were largely ghost towns for the large part of 2020. And then in 2021, you started seeing the hospitals open up for non-COVID patients, and they started to fill up again. And I was watching hospital capacity throughout the spring and summer of 2021 because they had real-time data at that point. And things were really quite normal. I mean, and the other thing to remember is the hospitals really want to be full. I mean, just like the restaurant wants to be full. They want to line out the door. I mean, they have they're money-making operations. And the closure of the hospital system to non-COVID patients was devastating for the financial bottom line of hospitals, and that made them highly dependent on government subsidies. So when the government came along and said, look, if you classify somebody as a COVID death, you're going to get $70,000 bonus from Medicare. Well, next thing you know, we got everybody dying of COVID, or so they claimed. It was really just that there was a positive PCR test, and if you could somehow mark the death certificate as being COVID, then the hospital got an infusion of funds from the government, which made up for all the money they lost during the 2020 hospital closures. I noticed that our friend there, our doctor friend, doesn't mention anything about that. But people missed cancer screenings, normal diagnostics. I mean, kids even missed vaccines. Which is another fascinating thing. We have the lowest level of childhood vaccination we've had in many decades as a result of these closures. I mean, people got
vaccines
genuinely
a higher priority.
sick. Yeah, it's like the whole healthcare system is reoriented to give everybody the COVID jab, which turns out to be, of almost useless at best.
I just like how his new excuse is that, he might not have been for locking down if it had just been done at the beginning, but we know they were so much more strident for lockdowns at the beginning. Like the way they treated Sweden or Florida or South Dakota, like he was going to be, more open to the Great Barrington Declaration in March of 2020.
Oh, that doesn't make any sense. The real argument against the Great Barrington Declaration I've heard comes from NIH and Fauci and Francis Collins and these kinds of people. They didn't like that these doctors were departing from the industry line. They thought that they were doing an end run around the official channels of communication. And I know this for a fact. I mean, like Francis Collins told a friend of mine the other day at a cocktail party that the Great Barrington Declaration wasn't wrong. The problem is that it wasn't approved, that they dared go outside the CDC, FDA, NIH, public health channels of communication to say something that was slightly different from what Fauci was telling everybody to say. And for that reason, they wanted to shut him up. And that's why Collins called for a quick and devastating takedown. So this was the real crime of the authors, was daring to speak their minds.
For someone like Amesh, who is saying he didn't like the lockdowns, he seems to be rationalizing them a lot. Like he'll talk about hospital capacity, but that's really a rationalization for why you should lock people down, so that they don't overwhelm the system. He's talking about all these problems that would arise if the government didn't take these harsh measures, but he seems to be against them. So why isn't he focusing on government regulations and mandates and us moving towards a more fascistic or socialized system? Why isn't he taking that orientation? Instead, he seems to be taking a defensive stance, in defense of what the establishment did.
This is typical these days. All the people that were de facto for lockdowns all deny that they were, because the whole pandemic response paradigm is completely collapsed and been discredited, and so now nobody wants to own it. So they all pretend as if they had a slightly different plan. I would have preferred it to take place more voluntarily, more at the local level. I would have put kids in classrooms sooner, blah, 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 blah. But, the thing is that once you sort of approve compliance with the masters at the top, you're stuck with going along with whatever they favor, whether you, and what's interesting is all the people who these days claim that they never wanted to shut the schools. I wanted the kids back in the classrooms a lot sooner. There's no record of them at the time having done this. And in fact, there's a record of the people like my friend Jennifer Say, who was in line to be CEO of Levi's, was denouncing on Twitter the school closures. Well, she got fired from her job. That was typical. The people who were arguing for opening schools were fired and smeared and attacked by the labor unions, by New York Times, by Fauci, and so on and so on. Now they all claim that they wanted schools to open, but we have the receipts. And you've seen the endless videos of Fauci, flipping this direction, that direction. They all just pretend like they weren't on the side of evil. I mean, the whole thing is straight out of Atlas Shrugged, really.
Well,
The
yeah, the
State
big-
Science Institute.
Yeah, the big lesson is really how fearful the population is of being canceled or losing their job. I mean, that seems to be the overwhelming concern that we learned from COVID.
Careerism drove a lot of people's opinions, and that's a big shock to me. I did not realize the extent to which people willing to sell out all their principles and all their ideals and all their morals just to make sure that they have that money stream coming in so they can pay their cell phone bill and their rent. I mean, it's unbelievable how easy it is to buy people's principles out. It's incredible. Rand was right about that too.
Did you notice he starts to use the establishment's "let it rip" smear before correcting himself that they're not supposed to say that anymore?
Yeah, that was funny.
Amesh goes on to say that he wasn't anywhere near against it the way many of his colleagues were, and that he would have liked to have seen more debate about it, at least if it wasn't already 7 months into the pandemic.
I think it should have been part of an open debate of how to think about what the best policy would be. But at that point, I think that we were in a situation where hospitals might collapse and were collapsing. Hospitals in Florida are running out of oxygen. That's just not a sustainable approach. And we're all tied together in the same health system. And if those hospitals go down, there's no healthcare for there's no ability to purchase healthcare or to access healthcare for anybody. And I think that's the issue. I think doing that earlier might have made more sense but if we were doing the correct actions, but doing it at that stage, I think really wouldn't have been as beneficial. And maybe I don't have all the details correct of the Great Barrington, so I'm with that caveat.
That's some caveat. Doesn't have all the details of Great Barrington Declaration?
The Great Barrington Declaration was about 750 words, so it was about the length of a typical op-ed article in USA Today. So anybody who claims they didn't have the details of it is just the laziest human being alive. I mean, I certainly wouldn't trust them with a pandemic response. And I can't make any sense out of what he's saying. I mean, so earlier we heard how we should have been proactive in lockdown earlier. And then he says, and then we have another clip where he's saying it's actually not a very serious disease. Looks like it's going to be a bad flu. And then in October, he's saying, well, this strategy of let society go on would have made sense early in the pandemic, but it doesn't make any sense now. So this is over the course of keep in mind, about 8 months. So nothing fits with anything else really. And the idea that I would have to check this claim that Florida hospitals were running out of oxygen.
I lived in Florida. I don't remember this healthcare crisis. In fact, by the end of 2020, 2021, everyone was already starting to move to Florida to get away from lockdown restrictions.
Yeah, that's really true. The other thing that's a little bit strange about what he's saying is, there's a presumption that if we had locked down in October of 2020, then Florida would not have run out of oxygen. I mean, so here's the problem. There really isn't any evidence that you can find anywhere that lockdowns had changed the trajectory of the pandemic at all. I mean, and I think I've seen every conceivable study, but you can't find one that shows that lockdowns achieved anything, even in delaying infection. And part of the reason is you can't time the lockdowns correctly. So in theory, if you knew for sure that you had a community spread, and by community spread, I mean like really, and say a square mile, a pathogen's on the loose and it's going crazy, and you order everybody home for a couple of days, in theory, you could diminish the rate of infection. But the problem is, we can't seem to find any empirical evidence to that effect. I mean, you think that that's possible, but we have now a whole world of data in 3.5 years to look at, and many case studies of lockdowns and not lockdowns and this and that, and we can't seem to find any kind of correlation at all between locking down and change the trajectory of the virus. And I think, just to put it plainly, the reason is that the virus is a lot smarter than the government. That's the
Low bar.
yeah. I mean, and you know this from your own experience. Everybody knows this. I mean, there are times because we've all been a little bit weirded out by this whole idea that we're surrounded by pathogens. And over the last 3.5 years, there are times when you went to a cocktail party and you thought, I bet I'm going to get COVID from here. And you didn't. And so then you went to another one, you thought, well, I'm definitely going to get COVID here. And then you didn't. Then by the time you got COVID, it turns out to be, something, I mean, you don't recall having done anything that would have caused you to get it. It's just too tricky. It's too individuated. The immunological map of your own system is different from everybody else's. The conditions, the precise conditions under which a virus hops from one person to another, it's very difficult to game that or know. You don't even know for sure, when you got COVID, where you got it. You think you did, but we're just kind of reconstructing things. Which is a funny way in which we play games with our mind. We think, I bet I got it on the elevator from that weird Iraqi guy I was staying on the elevator with or whatever. We tend to demonize the others,
They pretended like masks would work. They said, wear your masks and, the droplets won't reach other people. But we've learned that the masks don't work. And so you had people going to concerts wearing masks and then infecting people and not even knowing it. So the government just was giving false information and people were having a false sense of security. And also, if people get sick, they go to the hospital, the emergency rooms. I had to do this with my girlfriend when she got COVID. And you go to these emergency rooms and they're just packed with people who are sick. And then all those people who have to go home because they don't have a severe case, they infect people in their household. And the virus can spread in so many different ways that it's almost pointless to have any sort of shutdown.
That's true. One of the fascinating aspects of this is, and speaking of, just a footnote on the mask thing, we knew the mask didn't work. I mean, everybody knows. You can look at the microfibers of a mask and see that they're thousands of times larger than viral particles. So that's just ridiculous that they could have somehow stopped a pandemic. But the case of hospitals is fascinating because people don't understand. So the reason they used ventilators in the early days of the pandemic was that when people come to the hospital and they test positive for COVID, the staff would panic and want them to stop breathing into the air because they're afraid they're going to spread COVID. So they'd immediately shove a tube down the throat so that when they breathe into a machine and then the machine would breathe back into them. So they'd create this kind of closed circuit of breathing so that they could keep the air pure from COVID. That's why people were vented. They weren't vented to keep them from dying. In fact, there's like a 80+% chance you're going to die from ventilators. They're invented to keep other people from getting the disease because they believe that that's what that would achieve.
Yeah. Well, this actually dovetails into the next clip because Amesh makes the claim that the vaccine did stop the spread of COVID with the early strains, even if we can't see it so much now.
The efficacy was off the charts when we first saw it, 95% with protection against infection, which was incredible. Nobody expected that. Again, remember, we were trying to prevent severe disease here. Mm-hmm. But you have to remember that efficacy is derived from the ancestral strain. This virus is continuously mutating. So it had a 95% efficacy that lasted with the ancestral strain, lasted through Alpha and some of Delta. But by the time Omicron came around, and that was expected that we would get a mutant like that, the efficacy against infection dropped. It's not very good at stopping infection anymore, stopping transmission the way it once was. That context changed, the science changed, and the vaccines don't really do that anymore.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, it's really something to claim that the vaccine was 95% effective against a strain that no longer was dominant in the population.
That's how they cleared out those hospitals so quickly.
Yeah, I am just, as somebody who makes that same nonsense gibberish is Deborah Birx, And it's funny because he calls it the ancestral strain, but let's call it wild type, which we know wild type was circulating in the United States from October 2019 and kept growing and spreading October, November, December, January, February, March. By April, there was already a new strain called Alpha. So when, and by the way, these viruses mutate, and that's why you can't vaccinate against them. I mean, that's why you cannot have a vaccine against a coronavirus, because they have too many changes of clothes. They have a big wardrobe and they just go to the wardrobe and put on a new suit of clothes, every few months. So by the time the vaccine came around, the dominant strain was Delta. Well, that was already 2 strains old. The vaccine was designed for a virus that was no longer circulating. So in what sense could that possibly be effective? And that's an outrageous claim. Like, well, in the laboratory is 95% effective against wild type. Well, 95% effective, by the way, is such a confusing claim, because what it really means is that if you have 10,000 people who got it and 10,000 people who didn't get it, and then you have 10 people who or got the vaccine, and then you have 10 people who got COVID, and then only 2 people from the vaccinated branch that did get it, then you calculate the difference between those two and then say there's a percent difference of the percent. So that's where they come up with 95%. In other words, just pure propaganda.
Even from things he said earlier, there's ways you can kind of switch the data and focus on one set.
Yeah. Oh, that was just a lie. And then not to mention the fact that the damn vaccine, like even under the best conditions, if it does provide some protection against spread or infection, it's only short term for 2 or 3 months. And another thing that's really interesting about this is there are 3 standards by which you have to judge a vaccine. One is necessity, the other is safety, the other is efficacy. So necessity was not the necessity standard was 96% of the population did not even get to the first stage of do you need this vaccine. The trials were all over the place. They were recruiting 16-year-olds to these trials, which is just unbelievable. The only people who in principle even needed a vaccine that actually worked would have been people age 70 and older with comorbidities. But then you would have to give them a vaccine that would last, say, longer than 2 or 3 months. I mean, what does that even mean? And then it has to be targeted correctly. So the government was constantly behind. So they released a vaccine for wild type, at the time when Delta was already circulating. So we're already 2 strains old. And then that mutated and mutated again. And eventually we get Omicron. So then they come up, so then they kept having to boost and boost and boost. And they came up with the bivalent. Well, already the bivalent was a mix of wild type and Delta, which, both of which were already gone by the time so it was just this amazing example of central planning, always fixing problems of the past, but not any of the problems of the present. So it's so presumptuous and so outrageous, and he obscures that. What does it mean to invent a perfect vaccine for a strain that's not circulating right now? What possibly could that mean? And what a commentary on the failures of the state pharma partnership here.
It's almost like they want to take credit. The vaccine companies want to take credit for the natural immunity people developed from just getting COVID initially, and then having some natural immunity to, whatever strains or variants came afterward. They say the vaccine had 95% effectiveness against infection. Well, how much of that is actually due to just someone having a natural immunity and having a good immune system?
Well, that was another thing, that none of the vaccine trials ever tested people for antibodies before they put them in the trials. I mean, that never happened. So we actually know very little. One of the things and the reason for that is that they really wanted to take credit for ending the pandemic. That was extremely important to the whole industry and to government. That was a top priority. They wanted the history to say that the vaccine ended the pandemic. I worried for a while they're going to get away with that, but I don't think anybody really believes that anymore. This pandemic, if there was a pandemic, ended the way they all end, which is through natural immunity.
Well, that's one of Amesh's lines now, is that the big pharma is the saviors of the pandemic.
Right, that big spike in early 2021.
Yeah.
In this next clip, Amesh is ready to accuse doctors who dared dissent on vaccines of being motivated by money. And, it's funny, YouTube actually pulled a show of ours when a guest suggested someone else in the establishment might be getting paid.
And some of the doctors that are out there that are advocating anti-vaccine positions, some of them are disgruntled. They were people that worked in the field and for whatever reason it didn't pan out. And they've kind of doubled down and they're making a lot of money by spreading disinformation. And I think that anybody that honestly looks at the data, even if you're a layperson, not a doctor, you can see the benefit of the vaccines. You can go to your hospital right now in your town and see the benefit of the vaccines. Go to the ER and say, how many people here have COVID? They're in your ICU. You're going to see what the difference is. You just go back in time to 2020, 2021. You can see what the vaccines have done. So I think it's not an honest position. I think it really requires massive evasion.
That's an amazing smear of a lot of really, really great people. There are many people associated with the frontline critical care COVID Alliance doctors who dedicate vast amounts of their time doing telemedicine for free and pushing, encouraging people to take generic repurposed drugs like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and many others. Vitamin D, get out in the sun, get some exercise, zinc. There's no money in that. No money. I mean, these people dedicated vast amounts of their lives. My doctor is Pierre Corey, and when I by the way had the worst case of COVID of anybody my age I know. It was really bad. I never went to hospital because I knew for sure they'd kill me. But I called Pierre up and just on my cell phone, and he talked me through, all my symptoms and this and that, gave me prescriptions and literally never once charged me any money. I mean, these people are great men, and also they gave up their careers to do it because a lot of them are harassed by the medical boards and smeared by the media and so on.
Right. Having all those guys turn against you and then having your social media accounts kicked off, and it's no pleasure cruise. It's much easier to cave to the establishment.
You said it.
When your orientation is not towards objectivity, it tends to be towards psychological projection. Like when he says things like, these doctors are making lots of money spreading disinformation. Well, who does that sound like? I mean, it doesn't sound like the doctors who are right about COVID.
Well, people claim, I hear this all the time that Brownstone is funded by dark money. I mean, I'm looking at $30 billion being spread around by the NIH and trillions of dollars in the pharmaceutical industry. We've got 6,000 small donors and a staff of 3. I'm sorry, and I'm not paid. I mean, give me a break. I mean, the idea that this is some sort of money-making grift. Yeah, that's definitely a case of projection.
Yeah, as if there's some big anti-pharma lobby.
No, there's not a big anti-pharma lobby. Yeah, these people are amazing. It's funny because when I first started posting about this, I said, "Wait, are you part of the anti-vaccine lobby?" And I never even heard of an anti-vaccine lobby. I never even knew that such a thing existed. I mean, people accuse me of being an anti-vaxxer. I mean, at the time, I was like, "What are you even talking about?" I've never even thought about this issue. I mean, truly, I was super naive when I first started fighting the lockdowns and the pandemic response, and thinking that this had nothing to do with pharma and the goal of vaccine companies making money with some experimental technology like mRNA. I didn't even know about it. And I certainly didn't know about some resistance groups that had been on to this for a long time. I know about them now. And actually, some of these people are the smartest people ever. And none of them can be correctly described as anti-vax, by the way. I mean, I heard people tell me early on, do not give any kind of positive reviews of RFK's book on Fauci. Well, I read the book and I thought it was wonderful. People kept telling me, do not praise this book. He's a real anti-vaxxer. Well, he's not an anti-vaxxer. He's all for vaccines that are safe and effective and have been properly tested. Unfortunately, not many of them pass that test. but that doesn't mean he's anti-vax. I mean, that he's not anti-vax. We've had knowledge of natural immunity and how exposure leads to provoking the immune system to a protective response. We've known this since the Peloponnesian War, and people have been pursuing inoculations against smallpox for many centuries. I mean, George Washington used this for his troops in the Revolutionary War. So to be against vaccine technology is to be against common sense, but that doesn't mean you should be uncritically minded when a big company comes out with new technology, mRNA, and wraps it in a lipid nanoparticle and wants to inject it in people over the course of just a handful of months with no real valid testing. I mean, I think you can be against that and also be pro-vaccine. Right. So, this is just
case by case basis.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things Amesh said in this recent interview is that he's proudly a pharma shill. And one of the tactics of these pharmaceutical shills is to put you on the defensive by smearing you with these labels like anti-vax. So if you're against any aspect of the COVID vaccine, suddenly you get lumped into the crazy anti-vax movement, and then you're on the defensive, and now you have to come up with reasons why you're not against all vaccines, and that just distracts the focus of the debate.
Yeah, I really have gotten much tougher about these things. I mean, people accuse me of all sorts of things. Do you know that in the last 3 years, I've been accused not just being an anti-vaxxer, but of just crazy stuff like, well, I'm a child labor advocate. Well, okay, I mean, I sort of think that kids ought to get jobs when they're young. That's true. And then being an advocate of smoking. Well, I mean, I can think of worse things than smoking, so maybe that's true. But the other things that people said to me, like I'm a neo-Confederate, what? Or I'm a white supremacist, what? Or a white separatist, what? I mean, the amount of smears that have been deployed against the genuine anti-lockdowners, it's just amazing. But I've stopped responding to them. I mean, I think it's a huge mistake when people make these kind of smears.
Once you cross the establishment, they tend to target you.
Yeah.
Amesh is later asked if a scientific establishment could possibly realize they need to declare some drugs ineffective to get expedited approval for the COVID vaccine. And he claims no one wanted to discredit ivermectin or HCl.
I was part of that group of scientific experts. And when we saw the early data on ivermectin, we all hoped that it would work, just like we hoped hydroxychloroquine would work, because we wanted something that was cheap and easy to give people that would make them less likely to have severe disease. So there wasn't any discrediting in favor of the vaccine. Who did the trials? I mean, all of the how much money was spent to do these clinical trials, to look at ivermectin, to do hydroxychloroquine. It was actually put on protocols in hospitals that I work at, just as part of the research studies that we were doing real time. So I don't think anybody was discrediting it ahead of time to make room for the vaccines or to make room for Paxlovid.
The historical record does not support anything he just said. Already, repurposed generics were deprecated back in December of 2019, and by the time the vaccine came along, you could not get ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine in any Walgreens or CVS in this country.
They were warning doctors not to do any kind of off-label prescription.
Yeah, that's right. And even local pharmacies were intimidated. In Connecticut, I mean, I definitely needed ivermectin, by the way, when I was sick, and I was really sick. When I say really sick, by the way, I never missed a day's work. Okay, so if that gives you an indication, I just felt bad. Felt bad for too long. That's mainly because my immune system had been degraded from lockdowns and depression and God knows what. But I could not get ivermectin in Connecticut, anywhere in the state, and so the only way I could get it was by having somebody send it to me from New York, and they got it from India. So it was very difficult to get ivermectin in those days. By the time I actually got it, I have a huge stockpile now, by the way. But by the time I actually got it, I was sick for I had been sick for 3 weeks, and I just wasn't getting better, and it was kind of bad. But I took a cocktail of ivermectin and doxycycline, which is a antibiotic for secondary infections. The antibiotics won't kick in for 24 hours, but ivermectin starts working immediately. Within 3 hours, first time in 3 weeks, I felt the virus starting to release control of me. So and all the clinical trials that are credible actually show ivermectin is enormously great against a whole variety of viruses, not just parasites, but viruses too. And there's a new book out by Pierre Corey, by the way, on called "The War on Ivermectin" that goes through all this stuff. And you can believe it or not, but a lot of the anti-ivermectin studies were funded by the pandemic lobby themselves and by Big Pharma. The biggest one of all is called the Together trial, and that was funded entirely by, of all people, Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, together with the Charles Koch Foundation. And that was just deeply, deeply flawed. I can't right off the top of my head remember exactly what was wrong with it, but we have articles on Brownstone criticizing the Together trials. But
and the media was calling it horse medicine. I don't remember the scientific establishment standing up for it.
No, and you couldn't get it. I mean, it was really a tragedy. And then there are other countries where it was available over the counter. India, Mexico, you could get ivermectin everywhere. Mexico, but by the way, stayed entirely open throughout the pandemic. And I mean, they pretended to lock down, pretended to mask, and all this kind of stuff. It's typical Mexico, right? It's a funny culture where everybody pretends to comply and nobody does. So it's a wonderful place. But you can get ivermectin just over the counter without a prescription everywhere. You can buy it in vending machines for that matter, but not in the US. And the reason for that, and I'm sure this is the basis of the question that he was asked, is that under the emergency use authorization statute, there can't be any alternatives to the vaccine. So they had to deprecate and diminish and practically ban all repurposed generics that were effective in order to make room for the EUA, for the vaccine itself.
He acted like he'd never considered the concept before. Oh, we weren't trying to discredit anything. Well, eventually they get to my question on the Great Barrington Declaration, which I think at least elicits some concessions.
Scott says, in hindsight, weren't Fauci and Collins overzealously calling for a takedown of Great Barrington, given what we've learned about the full cost of lockdowns?
Well, I do think that there was a lot of people in government positions, including the NIH, that were threatened by that type of rhetoric, and they had wanted to speak with one voice. They had all committed to the strategy that they were following, and I think that they did treat some individuals associated with the Great Barrington Declaration unfairly. That I said earlier, there should have been a proper debate about this. It should have been discussed openly, and the pluses and minuses discussed, rather than try and ignore it or discredit it without actually debating it.
Yeah, a lot of people are saying that now. Even Birx kind of said that the other day in an interview. She was challenged. She was on an interview with Jay Bhattacharya, and she said that. So a lot of people are saying that now, that they acted too quickly. Well, it's nice to say that now, but at the time, it was vicious. I mean, the only reason we ever even got the Great, and by the way, there were a lot of letters signed by doctors around the world long before the Great Barrington Declaration. I mean, there was something like 4 or 5. The reason they didn't get attention is that they were using third-party platforms to distribute their declarations, and they're all being taken down by LinkedIn, by Medium.com. They were all being taken down. The only reason the Great Barrington Declaration cut through is that we bought a separate domain, and we had our own internal web developers and servers and private independent servers, and we made it around the establishment. But that was a technological solution. But the content of the declaration itself had been said many times by many people all over the world. So there wasn't anything new about it. The only thing that was different was that this one, we put together a suite of technology that allowed it to get out and then sustain all the attacks. But if we hadn't done that, they would have had it taken down within 24 hours.
You
I mean,
mentioned that you hear this a lot from different people, and I think that's just because they're receiving talking points from pharmaceutical companies for whom they're shilling out in the media. So they get their money, and then they deliver these remarks that Merck and other companies want them to say in the media. So that's why you hear a consistent message. It's because they're not giving you their considered honest opinion. They're working, maybe they don't tell you that they're working, but when they go on these news media segments, they're getting paid to appear and shill for the pharmaceutical companies.
And the media itself sells, 75 to 80% of the advertising on mainstream television channels is funded by big pharma shilling products. So of course they're completely acquiescent. And our friend really does tip his hand, I guess you would say. It's from a metaphor probably having to do with poker, when he says that we wanted to speak with one voice. Well,
right.
that's not science. Science doesn't have one voice.
There were some other things he said that people in the government, including the NIH, were threatened by that rhetoric, that they had all committed to the strategy that they were following, which is a translation for saying, discredit and do a devastating takedown of anyone with a dissenting opinion, which we know happened now. The scientific consensus was considered too important to allow debate, and this self-identifying objectivist says it like it's just another day at the office.
Yeah, it's amazing the way the one voice of science really became the one voice of the state, and you weren't able to tell the difference, and it was a totalitarian control of information flows, and that contradicts everything we know about science and everything we know about freedom. So it's very disappointing actually here. I guess that was at the Ayn Rand Institute, giving him voice.
He is one of their, I don't know if he's officially affiliated with them, but he's at OCON every year as one of their speakers, and he went through their OAC program years ago. So I mean, he's definitely affiliated with them. From what I understand, considers himself an objectivist. I mean, the way he, concedes that they treated the Great Barrington people unfairly. It reminded me of Arafat condemning terrorism. I mean, to the extent one is seeking justice, maybe he wants to write about some of these government NIH abuses. I'm sure his colleagues will appreciate his tough love approach, right?
It's just sad once people sign up to be propagandists, and I wouldn't say his message is very effective because it's just transparent. He's just an industry spokesman, and by industry I really do mean this weird combination of NIH and medical boards and pharmaceutical companies involved in a big opinion cartel to push their product and suck money out of the taxpayer and destroy civilization. Nobody associated with ARI should be on that side of the fence on this stuff. It's really pretty disgraceful.
They still are, and they're still defending what he's saying. So I mean, to me, he's apologizing for Fauci and Collins, but yet never actually standing up to them. But somehow we're to believe that he would have been more open to going against the consensus on lockdowns earlier in 2020.
Well, I suppose that it's easy for some people at this late date to say, this or that thing. But, when you're really tested is when it really matters is whether you're willing to stand up for principle when it can, in fact, make a difference, not years later when it doesn't actually matter as much. This is one of the great frustrations I had throughout because, I've been speaking out since early 2020, but I really wanted to be joined by other people, and I was astonished at just how few there were, actually. The Atlas Society, by the way, is another group dedicated to
Yeah,
sort
I'm
of,
affiliated with them.
yeah, brand and objectivism, that sort of thing, really did have a great opinion about this from the very beginning. And I really appreciate those who stuck their necks out early on. And I really think they deserve support. The people you need to support are those who are standing up for principle when it matters, not just reconstructing a fake version of their own personal history after it doesn't matter.
Absolutely. Jennifer Grossman interviewed Ed Dowd a couple of weeks ago showing excess deaths in, later 2021. That video got pulled by YouTube. I'm pretty sure this one's going to get pulled too, but we'll put it back up somewhere else.
It'll be pulled. Yeah, I mean, it's very disappointing, to see how Google and YouTube have just signed up to become agents of state propaganda in the intelligence community, really. But at least we do have Rumble and we have other sources out there. It's not a market for information. The COVID era really did lead to a kind of cartelization of big tech in ways that have been devastating, disappointing for me, because, I had great optimism at the beginning of the digital age that we were going to have free flows of information. I'd never imagined that industry could get so captured by government. I didn't even think it was possible. So I've learned a lot.
Yeah. Well, later Amesh is asked about how there were emails showing that health officials stifled debate on the lab leak theory early on to avoid upsetting China, and whether that showed politics trumping science.
Well, there's definitely sensitivity about saying that was the case, but I would tell you internally, everybody was running that possibility down. So even if it wasn't being stated publicly, the intelligence agencies and the governments were actually looking at that possibility right away, that was happening. So I think there is sensitivity when you're going to say that happens. There's always sensitivity around infectious disease, where it came from, in the stigma that occurs. We saw that with Ebola. We saw that with the 2009 H1N1 pandemic in Mexico getting stigmatized. So people are very careful and diplomatic about how they say that. But that in the back channels, people were running that down. And I just don't think we know. And I don't think we will. It's really incumbent on the Chinese government to actually come clean, and they will not.
Well, he was quite nervous during that little discourse, wasn't he? They knew from the very beginning that it was a lab leak. They figured it was. The problem is that the U.S. had funded the gain of function research. Gain of function research is what every lab in the world has started to do, and the way it works is they try to anticipate the mutations of various viral strains, so they can come up with ways to inoculate against it. It's all fantasy because none of it works, actually. I mean, they use gain of function oftentimes even to anticipate flu strain. That doesn't work. And it's all very tied in with the bioterrorism industry. So the idea is that, we're going to have a lab invent a bioweapon and give our soldiers the antidote so that we can be protected, and meanwhile killing the enemy. I mean, this is all just straight out, ridiculous fake movie plots. This stuff doesn't actually work in practice. But U.S. and NIH have a very tight relationship with the Wuhan Institute, and that was in turn connected very closely with CIA a venture called Eco Health Alliance, which is headed by Peter Daszak, and who's definitely associated with the intelligence community. So it kind of wrapped up the entire establishment in this, and that's why in late January, when they began to believe that this had leaked from the lab, that why Jeremy Farrar at the Wellcome Trust in the UK and Fauci and Daszak and all the rest of these people went to burner phones and secure sources of communication, and immediately alerted the FBI because they thought it was a bioweapon. And then they came up with this fake paper. I think it was February 2nd or 3rd. They released a fake paper denying it was a lab leak. So that was just all kind of to cover up what they knew was likely true.
Yeah, I don't doubt they were having robust internal discussions, but it was about how to squelch any public debate on the issue.
Yeah, that's right.
Another case where they wanted to speak with one voice, or they were threatened by the rhetoric.
Yeah. Well, and the other problem is they really wanted these two things out there. They wanted, on one hand, to tell everybody they weren't in any sense responsible for lab leak. There was no lab leak. But internally, they were trying to sound the alarm that it was a lab leak so that they could persuade Trump to go along with the lockdowns. So they had both lines moving at the same time. So the intelligence community was pushing the idea that it was a lab leak because they thought that would be more likely to convince Trump to lock down. And then for the public, they had a different line that it wasn't a lab leak, that it was just, a wet market. So, and even today, here we are 3.5 years later, we still have both views circulating out there, and it's going to be for the duration. They want both things out there because that's what they were saying from the very beginning. They had two different lines for two different people, and the truth be damned. But I think the truth is that it definitely was caused by a lab leak, and lab leaks are very, very common. It's not an unusual lab leak. It just so happened that this one was
I just think there's a little bit of a Kantian sense from him of just throwing his hands up and saying the lab leak question is unknowable because China won't talk. I mean, their silence speaks volumes, and so does the scientific community running cover for them.
Yeah, and I'm not a specialist in this area, but I have many friends who are, and they tell me that there's no doubt that they sequenced the viral strain and put a number on it in January, and you can see that exact strain in the lab work that was being done at the time of Wuhan. So there's really no doubt about it. And it's not even, I mean, again, friends of mine who are scientists in this, who understand this stuff and study this for a living, it's their whole life. There's absolutely no doubt that it was that SARS-CoV-2 came from the lab.
Well, this has been great. I appreciate you so much for going over these clips. I think you've had some great insights. One just quick question on the upcoming primaries. Can DeSantis use Fauci against Trump in the debates?
I think so. I think we're still pretty early on. It looks like Trump has everything sewn up, but he's extremely vulnerable on the pandemic response for obvious reasons. He spent many trillions of dollars and printed trillions to cause the inflation and wrecked the country, and then just kind of washed his hands of it. Now he pretends like it never happened. Not to mention the jab itself, right? And the rushed technology of mRNA. I mean, he was the custodian of all that stuff. So he's very vulnerable on that. And it all depends if GOP voters believe that DeSantis can win in the general, then they'll support him. And I think there's a real possibility. I mean, we're still very early on in this process, so I think there's a real chance. I also wouldn't count out JFK on the Democrats' side because he's enormously popular, and Biden's not. So and the other thing is the top of the ticket on the Democrat side are going to have to change horses midstream. Biden really isn't good for another term, and everybody knows that. So they're going to have to put in the guy from California.
Newsom. Or Michelle O's being floated again.
Yeah, and so that's a little bit implausible. So we're looking at times of great political upheaval. I do think in the end we're looking at a political solution to the current problems. One of the things that I think is definitely coming in the next several years is the elimination of the indemnification against damages that are currently enjoyed by big pharma and the vaccine companies in particular. And when that happens, the stocks of many dozens of companies are going to fall to zero.
Well, I hope it doesn't stop research on legitimate.
No, it won't. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, research on legitimate drugs is being stopped by the current system.
Right.
What we really need is a free market, which we don't have.
Yeah, and people willing to stand up to conventional wisdom in the establishment. That's great. Well, William, any final thoughts or question?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up something that Amesh was asked in his recent interview. He was asked whether Big Pharma took advantage of the pandemic, and he came out and said no. And I was just wondering, what would your answer be, Jeffrey?
Yes. I mean, yes, by a million times. I've never seen anything like it. It was really something. in particular, the privileging of mRNA technology. The government invested, tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in research over 20 years, and they really wanted to deploy this on the population in emergency times because they knew they could never get away with it in normal times. So they used the fear of the pandemic to get the emergency use authorization, and privilege mRNA technology. There were 3 shots approved. Well, 4, but Novavax never went anywhere. But 3 main shots that were approved in the U.S. J&J, which used conventional technology, and 1 shot, and was really the market leader. When they saw that happening, and Pfizer and Moderna were falling behind, immediately Fauci went to the microphones and said, "Oh, we've discovered that the J&J vaccine causes blood clots and terrible things happen to you if you get it. So we're taking it off the market." And it was removed from the market for about 2 or 3 weeks and then put back on the market. And by the time it got back on the market, Pfizer and Moderna had achieved market dominance, and J&J never came back from that. So that was purely an industrial move on the part of Big Pharma and the NIH. Just an amazing quid pro quo, a level of corruption at the expense of public health like we've never seen in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I think that it's obvious they took advantage of the pandemic, as well as taking advantage of the government's, money supply and willingness to buy, millions of doses of vaccines. And if you can't see that, you've just lost all trust from me. I mean, the fact that Amesh thinks that they did not take advantage of the pandemic is ridiculous. And it just shows that he's working off of some talking points from Big Pharma.
Yep, he's a shill. He's a shill. I mean, God bless him, but he's a shill. So a lot of people in his position are exactly that way, and I've begun to recognize them. And it's just, I like to take everybody seriously, but after a while, it's not really possible. Once you just sign up to become a propagandist and anticipate everything you're going to say, and you realize you're not speaking for yourself, you're speaking in your own career interest and on behalf of your friends and on behalf of a cartel.
Well, this has been a lot of fun, very enlightening. Like we said, we'll put up the show where we can, when we can, for as long as we can. And I just want to thank you so much just for being out there and just keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you. It's really been a lot of fun. I love a chance to deploy my knowledge on this subject. I've worked really hard for 3.5 years to gain some insight to this whole thing, and I'm really happy to share it and glad for an opportunity.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Well, I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. This is the Ayn Rand Fan Club, and we will see you next time.